The morning sunlight filtered through the grand windows of the sprawling country estate, casting golden beams onto rows of meticulously arranged chairs draped in white and gold. It was the perfect setting for a dream wedding, the kind of ceremony meant to inspire envy in glossy magazine spreads. Mark Turner, a successful architect in his late 40s, adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, smiling nervously at his reflection in a gilded mirror. Today was the day he would marry Vanessa, the woman he believed was his second chance at love. But across the estate, in a quiet corner of the bridal suite, 19-year-old Kayla Turner sat with her hands gripping a thick folder. Her heart raced as her eyes scanned the contents for the 100th time. The evidence was clear, damning, and undeniable. Vanessa was not who she pretended to be. Kayla had spent months trying to convince her father that something was off about Vanessa. The way she avoided questions about her past, her sudden appearances at events that Mark attended, and her overly polished charm had raised countless red flags. But each time Kayla voiced her concerns, Mark brushed them aside, chalking it up to Kayla's unwillingness to let him move on after the death of her mother. "Kayla, you're being dramatic," he had said just days before. "Vanessa makes me happy. Can't you just be happy for me?" Kayla hadn't argued further then, but she knew she couldn't stay silent today. With trembling hands, she closed the folder and stood. She had to act. If she didn't, her father would marry a fraud, a woman who would likely leave him heartbroken, financially ruined, or worse. The ceremony began with a flourish. Guests sat in neat rows, their chatter softening as the classical music swelled. The air was filled with the scent of fresh roses, and sunlight danced on the polished marble aisle. Mark stood at the altar, his smile nervous but hopeful, as the officiant whispered reassurances. Kayla watched from the back, hidden behind a pillar. She had to time it perfectly. Her stomach churned with anxiety, but her resolve was unshaken. She glanced at Vanessa, who was making her grand entrance on the arm of her father, her white gown shimmering under the sunlight. Vanessa looked every bit the perfect bride. Her smile was radiant, her movements graceful. But to Kayla, the image was a carefully constructed lie, a mask hiding something much darker. She took a deep breath, clutching the folder tightly. As Vanessa reached the altar and turned to face Mark, the officiant began the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to celebrate the union of Mark and Vanessa." Kayla's heart pounded in her chest. "If I don't stop this now, it'll be too late." She took a step forward, her voice trembling but loud enough to carry over the murmurs of the crowd. "Stop!" The room froze. Heads turned, and whispers rippled through the guests like a wave. Mark's smile faltered, confusion etched on his face as he looked toward the source of the interruption. Vanessa's expression, initially one of shock, quickly hardened into something more calculated. Kayla stepped into the aisle, her legs shaky but her voice growing steadier. "Dad, stop. You don't know who she really is." "Kayla, what are you doing?" Mark's tone was sharp, his face a mixture of embarrassment and anger. Vanessa's voice was smooth, laced with mock concern. "Kayla, honey, I know this is difficult for you, but—" "Don't," Kayla snapped, her eyes blazing. She turned back to her father, holding up the folder. "I tried to tell you before, but you wouldn't listen. Vanessa isn't who she says she is. I have proof." The crowd erupted into hushed murmurs, and Mark looked at Kayla, his confusion deepening. "Proof? What are you talking about?" Kayla stepped closer, her voice shaking but determined. "She's lied about everything. Her name, her past, even her intentions. She's been married before, multiple times, under different names. Each time, the man ended up losing everything, his money, his property, his reputation. And when she was done with them, she vanished." Vanessa's expression darkened, her calm demeanor slipping for the first time. "That's ridiculous," she said, her voice rising. "She's making this up. Mark, she's trying to ruin our day." Kayla ignored her, opening the folder and pulling out a stack of documents. "These are court records, Dad. Bank transfers, police reports, even marriage certificates with her other names. I didn't want to believe it either, but it's all here. Mark took a step back, his face pale as he reached for the papers. The guests watched in stunned silence, their eyes darting between Kayla, Vanessa, and Mark. As Mark flipped through the documents, his hands began to tremble. He looked at Vanessa, his voice barely above a whisper. Is this true? Vanessa's smile returned, but it was forced, brittle. Mark, you know me. This is a misunderstanding, a smear campaign, or... Enough, Mark said, his voice firmer now. He turned back to Kayla, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. Kayla, are you sure about this? Kayla nodded, her gaze unwavering. I'm sure. Vanessa's composure finally cracked, her face contorting with anger. You little, she began, but Mark held up a hand. Vanessa, I need answers. Right now. And with that, the dream wedding turned into a nightmare no one would forget. The once beautiful wedding scene now simmered with tension. The vibrant flowers, the golden sunlight streaming through the windows, and the perfectly dressed guests felt out of place as the air thickened with disbelief and unease. All eyes were on the bride, whose face had gone pale, and on Kayla, who stood with steely determination, clutching her folder of evidence. Kayla, Mark said, his voice a mix of confusion and anger, what exactly are you accusing Vanessa of? Kayla took a deep breath, steadying herself. I'm accusing her of lying about who she is, Dad. She's not who you think she is. She's been married multiple times under different names, and every time, the pattern is the same. She charms her way into a man's life, drains him financially, and disappears. A ripple of gasps swept through the guests, some leaning forward to catch every word. Vanessa's jaw tightened, and her hands clenched the bouquet so tightly the stems bent. But she quickly plastered on a forced smile, the one that had likely fooled so many before. This is absurd, Vanessa said, her voice loud and sharp. She's making this up because she can't stand the thought of her father moving on. Mark, you know me. You know I love you. Mark looked at her, his brows furrowed, then turned back to Kayla. You have evidence? Yes, Kayla said, stepping closer and opening the folder. Everything is here, court records, police reports, even photos. Vanessa's used at least 3 different names. Her real name is Annette King, and she's wanted for questioning in connection with fraud cases in 2 states. The murmurs grew louder, a wave of shock and suspicion spreading among the guests. Kayla handed Mark the folder, and he hesitated before taking it, his fingers trembling. He flipped through the documents, his expression shifting from confusion to horror as he scanned the damning evidence. Marriage certificates with different names, financial transactions showing large withdrawals, and police reports describing a woman matching Vanessa's description were all there in black and white. Vanessa, Mark said, his voice low and strained, tell me this isn't true. Vanessa's eyes darted around the room, her confident facade starting to crack. Mark, she began, her tone desperate, I can explain. This is a misunderstanding. I never. Enough. Mark's voice rose, cutting her off. Is your real name Vanessa or Annette? Answer me. For a moment, the bride stood frozen, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, with a visible effort, she lifted her chin. Fine, she said, her voice icy. Yes, I've been married before. But those men meant nothing to me. You're different, Mark. I love you. Love me? Mark's voice cracked with emotion. You've been lying to me this entire time. How can you stand there and say you love me? Kayla stepped forward, her anger boiling over. You don't love him. You've been using him, just like the others. I warned you, Dad. I tried to tell you. Vanessa's gaze snapped to Kayla, her mask of composure completely gone now. You little brat, she hissed. You've been digging into my life like some kind of stalker. You think you're so clever? You've ruined everything. The guests gasped again, and a few started whispering angrily among themselves. One older woman near the front stood and pointed at Vanessa. You've been lying to all of us too. How dare you? At that moment, a man in the back of the room cleared his throat. Excuse me, he said, stepping forward. I couldn't help but overhear. I'm a private investigator, and I've been looking into someone matching Annette's description. Everything Kayla is saying checks out. Vanessa turned sharply toward him, her eyes wide. Who are you? What are you talking about? The man held up a badge. I've been hired by one of your former victims to track you down. You have a history of fraud, and I believe you know exactly what I'm talking about. The room fell into stunned silence. Mark dropped the folder onto the altar, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the revelation hit him. I can't believe this, he muttered. I trusted you. Vanessa's demeanor shifted again, this time to cold calculation. She dropped the bouquet and straightened her posture. Fine, she said, her voice dripping with venom. You want the truth? Yes, I lied. Yes, I've done what I needed to survive. But don't act like you're a saint, Mark. You wanted someone to make you feel alive again, and I gave you that. Mark stared at her, his face a mixture of fury and heartbreak. Get out, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Get out of my sight. Vanessa opened her mouth to retort, but before she could, Kayla stepped in front of her. You've done enough damage. Leave now, or I'll make sure you don't leave this estate without a police escort. Vanessa's eyes narrowed, but she saw the resolve in both Mark and Kayla's faces. With a huff, she turned and stormed out, her heels clicking furiously against the marble floor. The guests parted to let her pass, their gazes filled with judgment and disgust. As the door slammed behind her, Mark sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Kayla knelt beside him, placing a hand on his arm. I'm so sorry, Dad, she said softly. But I couldn't let her hurt you. Mark looked at her, tears in his eyes. Thank you, he whispered. I should have listened to you. The nightmare was over, but the fallout had just begun. The grand ballroom, which had been meticulously arranged for a fairy tale wedding, now felt like the setting of a courtroom drama. Guests murmured in hushed tones, exchanging shocked glances and shaking their heads as the weight of Kayla's revelations sank in. Mark sat slumped in a chair near the altar, his face pale and drawn, the folder of damning evidence lying discarded on the floor. Kayla remained by his side, her hand on his shoulder, steadying him as the reality of Vanessa's deception took hold. Vanessa, or Annette, as she was now revealed to be, had stormed out moments ago, her pristine bridal gown swishing angrily as she disappeared through the double doors. But the storm she had left behind was far from over. Vanessa didn't go far. Outside the estate, she stood pacing furiously near the valet station, her phone pressed to her ear. Pick up, she hissed, glancing nervously over her shoulder. The guests inside had turned against her, and she knew the walls were closing in. Finally, a voice answered on the other end. Annette? It's me, she snapped. I need help. They found everything. I need you to come get me. Everything? The voice replied, hesitant. Annette, I told you this was too risky. I can't get involved. Vanessa clenched her jaw. Coward, she spat, ending the call. She looked around, realizing her options were dwindling. The evidence Kayla had presented was overwhelming, and if the police got involved, it was only a matter of time before her entire scheme unraveled. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind her. Vanessa. She turned sharply to see Mark standing a few feet away, his expression a mix of fury and heartbreak. He had followed her outside, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Mark, she began, but he cut her off. Don't, he said, his voice low and shaking. Don't try to explain. I read the documents, Vanessa. Or should I say Annette? He shook his head, his eyes glistening. I trusted you. I let you into my life, into my home, into my family. Vanessa straightened her posture, the defensive edge creeping back into her voice. I didn't lie about everything, Mark. I do care about you. I Stop, he said, his voice rising. Caring about me doesn't involve lying to me about who you are. It doesn't involve stealing from other people or building a relationship on fraud. What were you going to do? Drain my bank accounts? Leave me like you left the others? Vanessa's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Her silence was answer enough. Inside the estate, the mood remained tense. The guests were divided into small clusters, some whispering indignantly, others sitting in stunned silence. Kayla had retreated to a quiet corner near the windows, watching her father through the glass as he confronted Vanessa. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a text from her best friend, Tasha. You okay? Saw the live stream. Girl, you're trending. Kayla sighed, her fingers hovering over the screen. She hadn't noticed anyone filming the chaos, but of course, in today's world, nothing went unrecorded. She typed a quick reply, I'm fine. Just trying to make sure Dad is okay. As she slipped her phone back into her pocket, a familiar voice startled her. Kayla? She turned to see Detective Harris, one of her father's longtime friends and a guest at the wedding. He was a tall, imposing man with a sharp gaze that missed nothing. I need to see that folder, he said, gesturing to the evidence Kayla had presented. Kayla nodded and handed it over without hesitation. It's all there, she said. Everything I could find. Harris flipped through the documents, his expression darkening as he read. This is bad, he muttered. If even half of this is true, she's in serious trouble. She's still outside with my dad, Kayla said. I don't trust her. Harris nodded, slipping the folder under his arm. I'll handle it. Outside, Vanessa's carefully constructed composure finally crumbled. Fine, she snapped at Mark. Yes, I lied. Yes, I've done things I'm not proud of. But don't act like you're some victim. You wanted someone to make you feel alive again, Mark, and I gave you that. Mark stared at her, his expression a mixture of anger and sadness. You didn't give me anything, he said quietly. You took my trust, my hope, and you twisted it into something ugly. At that moment, Detective Harris appeared. Vanessa, he said, his voice firm, we need to have a conversation. Vanessa turned to him, her eyes narrowing. Who are you? Harris. Detective Harris, he said, pulling out his badge. And I think you know exactly why I'm here. Vanessa's face drained of color. She glanced around, as though looking for an escape route, but Harris stepped forward, blocking her path. Don't even think about running. Back inside, Mark returned, his shoulders slumped but his expression resolute. He walked straight to Kayla and pulled her into a tight hug. Thank you, he whispered. For saving me from myself. Kayla hugged him back, tears pricking her eyes. We'll get through this, Dad, she said softly. Together. As the police escorted Vanessa off the property moments later, the guests slowly began to disperse. The dream wedding had turned into a nightmare, but for Mark and Kayla, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one built on truth, trust, and healing. The estate was a somber scene as the last of the wedding guests dispersed, their once cheerful chatter replaced by subdued murmurs of disbelief. The scent of roses lingered in the air, a bittersweet reminder of the ceremony that had unraveled before their eyes. Vanessa, or Annette, was gone, led away in the back of a police car. But the aftermath of her deception lingered, etched on the faces of those she had duped. Mark Turner stood near the altar, staring at the remnants of the life he almost walked into. The discarded bouquet lay on the marble floor, its petals scattered like the broken trust in his heart. Beside him, Kayla watched him carefully, unsure of what to say. The weight of her actions pressed on her chest. She had stopped her father from making a terrible mistake, but at what cost? I should have seen it, Mark said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was heavy with guilt. The signs were there, weren't they? Kayla hesitated before speaking. Maybe, she said softly. But, Dad, she was good at hiding the truth. That's what people like her do. They prey on trust. Mark turned to face her, his eyes filled with sorrow. "And I didn't trust you," he said. "You tried to warn me, and I ignored you. I let her drive a wedge between us." Kayla shook her head, placing a hand on his arm. "It's okay, Dad. You wanted to believe in her. That's not a crime. But now we have to figure out how to move forward." Inside the estate study, Detective Harris reviewed the evidence Kayla had gathered. The documents lay spread out on the desk, a damning collection of marriage certificates, financial statements, and police reports. "This is one of the most thorough amateur investigations I've seen," Harris said, glancing up at Kayla. "How did you pull this together?" Kayla shrugged. "I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about her. She was always vague about her past, and I started digging. It wasn't easy, but once I found the first red flag, everything else started falling into place." Harris nodded approvingly. "Well, you did a better job than most professionals. This is solid evidence. It's enough to move forward with a case against her." Mark, who had been sitting silently in the corner, spoke up. "What happens now?" Harris folded his arms. "She'll be charged with fraud and identity theft, at the very least. If we dig deeper, and I plan to, there could be more charges. She's left a trail, and it's time she faces the consequences." Mark exhaled heavily, the relief of knowing Vanessa would be held accountable mixing with the sting of betrayal. "Good," he said. I can't believe I let her into my life. Into Kayla's life. People like her are experts at manipulation," Harris said. "Don't beat yourself up too much. But take this as a lesson. Be cautious, especially when someone seems too good to be true." Kayla gave her father a reassuring smile. "We'll get through this," she said. "Together." The next morning, the story of Vanessa's arrest hit the news. Headlines splashed across television screens and websites. "Wedding shocker, fiancé exposed as serial fraudster and bride arrested for identity theft moments before saying I do." The footage from the wedding, recorded by a few guests, spread quickly on social media. Opinions poured in, ranging from outrage at Vanessa's actions to admiration for Kayla's courage in speaking out. For Mark, the public scrutiny was a difficult pill to swallow. He avoided the phone calls and texts from concerned friends and colleagues, retreating into the quiet of his home. But Kayla knew that silence wasn't the answer. "Dad," she said gently one evening, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, "you don't have to face this alone. Let's talk about it." Mark looked at her, his eyes tired but grateful. "I just feel so foolish," he admitted. "I should have listened to you. I should have seen it." "We all make mistakes," Kayla said. "What matters is that we learn from them. And you've taught me so much, Dad, about integrity, about resilience. This doesn't change who you are." Her words seemed to ease some of the weight on his shoulders. Mark nodded slowly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Thank you," he said. "For everything." Meanwhile, Vanessa's arrest sparked a larger conversation about fraud and manipulation. Kayla's bravery in exposing the truth inspired others to share their own stories of deception and survival. The attention led to new resources for victims of financial fraud, with nonprofits and legal organizations stepping in to provide support. Detective Harris continued his investigation, uncovering more victims in Vanessa's past. The evidence mounted, ensuring a strong case against her in court. Justice, it seemed, would finally be served. In the weeks that followed, Mark and Kayla began rebuilding their relationship, focusing on the bond that Vanessa's lies had nearly destroyed. They attended counseling sessions together, navigating the pain and healing one step at a time. One sunny afternoon, as they sat on the porch reminiscing about happier times, Mark turned to Kayla with a small smile. "You know," he said, "your mom would be so proud of you. You're so much like her, strong, brave, and relentless in doing what's right." Kayla blinked back tears, her heart swelling at the compliment. "Thanks, Dad. That means everything to me." The storm Vanessa had brought into their lives was over. And though the road ahead wasn't without challenges, they faced it together, stronger than ever. The weeks after the wedding that wasn't were a blur of emotions for Mark and Kayla. The estate, once adorned with flowers and decorations, now stood quiet, its halls echoing with memories of a day that had changed their lives forever. While Vanessa faced the consequences of her actions, Mark and Kayla began the process of healing, individually and together. The media frenzy around the event hadn't died down entirely. Every few days, new articles popped up detailing Vanessa's history. Her real name, Annette King, was now linked to numerous fraud cases, and more victims came forward to share their experiences. Detective Harris spearheaded the investigation, and the evidence Kayla had uncovered proved pivotal in building a watertight case. For Mark, each new revelation felt like another blow. He struggled with feelings of guilt and embarrassment, replaying the past year in his mind and questioning how he had missed the signs. He avoided social gatherings, ignored calls from friends, and spent long hours in his home office, trying to bury himself in work. Kayla, however, knew her father couldn't move forward without confronting his emotions. One evening, she knocked on his office door, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "Mind if I come in?" she asked softly. Mark looked up from his desk, his face lined with exhaustion. "Of course," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Kayla set the mugs down and sat, studying her father for a moment. "You've been in here a lot," she said gently. "Are you okay?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "I feel foolish. Humiliated. I let her into our lives, Kayla. I trusted her. I didn't listen to you when you tried to warn me." Kayla leaned forward, her expression empathetic. "Dad, it's not your fault. Vanessa, or Annette, was a master manipulator. She fooled a lot of people, not just you. And I wasn't angry because you didn't listen. I was scared. I didn't want you to get hurt." Mark's eyes softened. "I still should have been more careful," he said. "But you saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't have to thank me," Kayla said, reaching for his hand. "We're family. We look out for each other. That's what Mom would have wanted." At the mention of her mother, a bittersweet smile touched Mark's lips. "She would have been proud of you," he said. "I know I am." The bond between father and daughter grew stronger as they worked to rebuild trust and move forward. They began attending family counseling sessions together, a space where they could openly discuss their feelings and confront the pain Vanessa's betrayal had caused. The sessions were difficult at first, but over time, they became a source of healing and understanding. Kayla also found herself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. The courage she had shown in exposing Vanessa's lies caught the attention of advocacy groups and organizations dedicated to fighting fraud and raising awareness about manipulation. She was invited to speak at events, sharing her story to inspire others to trust their instincts and take action when something felt wrong. At one such event, Kayla stood on a stage in front of a packed auditorium, the spotlight warm against her face. "When I started looking into Vanessa's past, I felt scared and alone," she said, her voice steady. "But I knew I couldn't ignore my instincts. It wasn't easy to stand up and tell the truth, especially when it meant challenging someone I cared about. But I learned that doing the right thing isn't always easy, it's necessary." The audience erupted into applause, and Kayla stepped off the stage feeling both proud and humbled. She realized that her actions had ripple effects, inspiring others to take control of their own situations and fight back against deception. Meanwhile, Vanessa's legal troubles deepened. As more victims came forward and additional evidence surfaced, her charges multiplied. By the time her trial began, the case against her was airtight. She pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud and identity theft and was sentenced to several years in prison. Her parting words in court, directed at Mark, were bitter and venomous, but they no longer held any power over him. He had already begun to heal. On a crisp fall afternoon, Mark and Kayla sat on the porch of their home, sipping coffee and watching the leaves scatter in the breeze. The tension that had once hung between them was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and mutual respect. "You know," Mark said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been thinking about volunteering with one of those fraud prevention organizations you've been working with. Maybe I can use what I've learned to help others." Kayla beamed. "That's a great idea, Dad. You'd be amazing at it." Mark smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "Thanks, Kayla. And thank you for everything, for standing up for me, for us. I don't say it enough, but I'm so proud of the person you've become." Kayla's eyes shimmered with emotion, and she reached over to squeeze his hand. "That means the world to me, Dad. And I'm proud of you too, for facing everything head on and not letting it break you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of gold and pink, the Turners sat side by side, stronger than ever. The ordeal they had faced was painful, but it had also brought them closer, reminding them of the unshakable bond they shared. Together, they looked forward to a brighter, more honest future, one built on trust, resilience, and love.